Good morning. Today we're going to finish the book of Colossians. On this Saturday, we'll look at today and tomorrow's readings, chapters 3 and 4. Tomorrow morning, Sunday, October 12th, we'll have worship, and it'll be live on Facebook at 9 o'clock from Mabel and Sutton. Our Saviors in McHenry is not having worship tomorrow morning because Sutton has its annual soup and sandwich and bake sale. And so Cheryl and I will be down there helping with the soup and sandwich. So it's just, I mean, it's a annual fundraiser for and kind of goes for the women's group of the church. But if you know how churches run, they all work together for the good of the church. And we got, we're a small crowd down at Mabel, but there are many other family members that come and volunteer and help, and it's a good time good time of visiting and good soup and sandwiches and some good desserts as well. So if you're in the area, stop in from 11 to 1 and join us for a soup and sandwich. In these last two chapters of Colossians, especially chapter 3, Paul echoes a lot of what we read in Galatians and Ephesians and Philippians about rightful living. You've been raised with Christ. Seek things that are above, and you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And then verse 5 is especially where we hear echoes of what he's written to other churches. Put to death what is earthly, fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, greed. And then he says, which is idolatry. Put those behind you. And verse 6, he says, on account of these, those sins, the wrath of God is coming. And the wrath of God, of course, is hatred of sins. But it's also meaning, the wrath of God is coming. That's the final judgment, and so it's just that, he doesn't come right out and say that final judgment, but, the wrath of God is coming. It is what it indicates, that God's intense dislike. I'll say that. I don't like to use the word hatred, but God's intense dislike for sin will be the cause, at the final time of the judgment. And the judgment will be that some will be saved and some will not. And we read that many places in the Bible. And then he says, we've got to put away all of those things, anger, wrath, malice, slander, abusive language. Don't lie to one another. Be good citizens. Be the best person you can be. He says you have clothed yourselves with a new self. And so then in verse 10 or 12 it starts out as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved. Clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, patience, and again those echo, those fruits of the Spirit, and they also echo from Corinthians the characteristics of love. Love is patient, love is kind, love is, all of those things that we associate so much with marriage, and husband and wife. But, we remember that when it was originally written, Paul was writing to the people as to how to live together as community. And this is what Paul does in these letters to the different churches. This is how you live together in community. You don't bicker, you don't slander, you don't continually try to put yourself above others, but you work together for the good of all. And then he says, just as the Lord has forgiven you, you also must forgive. And again, this is a difficult thing oftentimes, but it's a reminder that, we are forgiven. Such a great debt of sin by God. And, it just doesn't make sense that we would not forgive someone else. And the final thing, he says, above all, and maybe I shouldn't say the final thing, but clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Clothe yourselves with love. And, if, there's an old song, love makes the world go round. And truly, when we love, when we show that compassion and generosity and meekness and kindness, and when we're we don't have that spiteful dislike and, self-righteous attitude, things make it, it just makes everything so much nicer. And so clothe yourselves with love, and that's putting on that compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, generosity, and above all, forgiveness. Those are traits of love. And Paul says, as Christians, clothe yourselves with Christ, because Christ shows us that immense love that God has for us. And he says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Indeed, you were called then to one body. And let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another. And do everything, in verse 17, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through him. And so it's, just again, that reminder of righteous living in a right manner with God and also with our fellow human beings. And it is so much nicer to be able to, greet people. We don't greet them with a holy kiss that Paul would talk about, but with friendship and with an open acknowledgement of their worthiness as well as our own worthiness. And then he goes on, starting in verse 18, talks about families. Wives, he says, be subject to your husband as is fitting in the Lord. And this is as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, never treat them harshly. This love is a two-way street. Marriage is a two-way street. We both give and take, and he goes on and he talks about family. So he's reminding them again of the individual family unit. I mean, he's been talking about community, and now he's talking about family unit, and the same characteristics. All of those deal just as much, if not more so, with family than they do with community. And then, he just, verses 18 through 21 are kind of that family stuff. And then verse 22, slaves, obey your earthly masters. And, Paul is in prison right now. And if you're familiar with the book of Philemon, Onesimus, a slave, was very possibly one of those that was communicating with Paul and doing Paul's errands and stuff in the city. And so as Paul is writing this about, slaves, obey your earthly masters, do your tasks and all of those things. So he's very possibly thinking of Onesimus. And we'll get to the book of Philemon in a while. We've got to go through Thessalonians and Timothy and Titus first. But it's a wonderful, short little book, short little letter that Paul writes, talking about the value of this one who seemingly has no value. And so Paul is not only aware of the situation within the communities, that there is some bickering. You think about going back, urge Euodia and Syntyche to have a similar mind, to be like-minded, to put their differences aside. And wonderful advice for all of us, to put our differences aside and to work together for the good of all. And, the first verse of chapter 4 is, masters, treat your slaves justly and fairly, for you know that you have a master in heaven. I don't consider myself a slave of God. I consider myself a child of God, a saved sinner of God's own choosing. But a slave, I just don't think of myself as a slave to God. I think of myself more as a person that knows he is a sinner and knows that he can't live a righteous life, and therefore relies on God for that forgiveness. But also, I look to God for that direction in my pathway. It's just like, Paul writing these letters of reminding us of how we should live. And there are many times that I realize, I sure didn't live up to what God would be expecting me to be. And so chapter 4 is just a reminder that we are citizens of earth and heaven. And he says, devote yourselves to prayer, conduct yourselves wisely toward outsiders as well as community, and let your speech be gracious. And then the final part of it is, he's talking about different people, commending them, encouraging them. And the final thing basically in this book is that, after you have read this letter, share it with the people of Laodicea. And also, you should read the letter to the Laodiceans. And in our Bible, we don't have a letter to the Laodiceans, but as many of Paul's letters were written, kind of naming one church, but they were to be shared with others. And we are so fortunate, as I said not very many days ago, that we have this collection of Paul's letters to all of these different churches, to all of these different people. And they all apply to us just as much today as they did to those people then.